In a parallel reality, Yu Manglong is still smiling, but in this world, he is a silent scream hidden behind the brilliant velvet curtains. Is it fair when a human being is erased in silence, leaving behind millions of fragments of insecurity and cries for help that were missed for far too long? The truth does not lie in what is officially announced, but is hidden within bloodshot eyes and broken sentences that we unintentionally bypassed. If you feel the heartbeat of a secret waiting to be awakened, please take a second to click like or subscribe so that we may search for the answer together. Your companionship is the way to ensure that the memories of Yu Manglong are never buried. In the parallel space of social media, Yu Manglong is still living. He sings, plays the cello, and rides his bicycle through peaceful streets, existing within small symbols created by the online community. There, he is not silent, he does not disappear, and he is not covered by unanswered question marks. He appears as a complete human being, preserved by the collective memory of hundreds of thousands of people who have never met him in real life. But in the real world, that presence has been interrupted. Not by a clear official statement, but by a prolonged, accumulating, cold, and nameless silence. It is this paradox that has caused the story of Yu Manglong to transcend the boundaries of an ordinary entertainment scandal. It has become a crossroads between art and power, between public image and individual autonomy, and between fame and human dignity. What prevents the public from turning away is not the loud accusations, but the feeling that something has been overlooked for too long. The bloodshot eyes during performances, the trembling voice in live streams, and the fragmented sentences like apologies to an unknown recipient. All appeared sporadically, but when placed side by side, they form an uneasy silhouette that many people began to see only too late. As the wave of signatures calling for the truth to be clarified surpassed hundreds of thousands, the story no longer belonged solely to Yu Manglong. It became a collective dialogue about conscience. Posters appeared beyond the borders of China, and messages written in many different languages shared a common theme. Justice has no borders, and human dignity should not be bargained away. However, behind that empathy lies an unavoidable question. What caused a young artist, who was once considered to have a stable future in the industry, to gradually fall into a state of isolation, control, and the loss of the right to decide his own life? Is this merely a personal tragedy, or is it the inevitable result of an operational mechanism that the public rarely sees from the inside? This analysis does not aim to hand down a verdict, nor does it seek a simple conclusion. Instead, it follows the traces of small details, overlooked timelines, and existing information gaps. From there, a broader picture gradually emerges, where an individual can become a symbol for systemic issues. Because behind the stage lights and glamorous contracts, the most important question remains open. When no one else speaks up, who will be held responsible for that silence? To understand what happened to Yu Manglong, one must step back far enough, beyond the explosion of public opinion, to observe the small details that appeared years ago. There is no single moment that can be identified as the beginning. Instead, it is a series of fragmented, silent signs that only become clear when looked back upon within the same time frame. One of the details most often mentioned is the video of Yu Manglong painting and asking viewers to guess the content. On the surface, it was a gentle, entertaining interaction. But for viewers who had followed him for a long time, the difference in the brushstrokes, the expression, and the atmosphere within the recording created an inexplicably dissonant feeling. The hollow sound, the space that did not resemble a familiar living environment, and the details interpreted in many different directions made this video a controversial piece of the puzzle. The problem did not lie in whether those speculations were right or wrong, but in the fact that they reflected a collective intuition. Something was wrong, even if no one had enough data to name it yet. Subsequent public appearances further reinforced this sense of unease. In a performance in 2020, Yu Manglong was noted for his red eyes, trembling voice, and a mental state unlike the typical image of an artist performing before the public. This was not a single, spontaneous moment. In a live stream a few months later, similar expressions recurred. He spoke in broken sentences, expressing apologies but without specifying the recipient. His gaze constantly drifted off camera, as if searching for validation or wary of something that could not be spoken. In the modern entertainment context, such expressions are often quickly labeled as personal emotional states or work pressure. However, when these signs appear repeatedly, the question is no longer about momentary emotions, but about what kind of environment created the pressure to maintain that state for a long time. An individual can control their image for a moment, but it is very difficult to maintain instability without a deep-seated cause. According to information spread by people who once worked closely with Yu Manglong, the period from 2020 marked a clear change in how he was treated professionally. Resources were cut, public appearance opportunities grew sparse, while contractual obligations and financial pressures did not diminish. This is the key to understanding the power imbalance. When an artist no longer has the right to choose their work, but must still bear financial and image responsibilities, the dependency becomes almost absolute. This pressure did not form overnight. The mentioned timelines show that Yu Manglong entered the trajectory of the entertainment industry from a very young age. Early exposure to competitions, influential figures in the industry, and promises of a professional future laid the foundation for an asymmetrical relationship. In that relationship, compliance is often seen as a prerequisite for survival. When resistance means losing everything one has built, the choice to remain silent becomes the path of least risk, even if it comes at the cost of mental health. Another detail often revisited is the way Yu Manglong reacted to seemingly harmless questions from the audience. At times he appeared tense, at times reacting more strongly than necessary, and then quickly apologizing. These reactions cannot be separated from the context of control. In an environment where every word can be interpreted, reported, or used as adverse evidence, caution becomes a survival reflex. Notably, throughout this stage, there was no official statement explaining Yu Manglong's condition clearly. The information gap persisted, leaving room for speculation to spread. That silence, for whatever reason, unintentionally created a space where the public pieced together the story from the fragmented bits they possessed. And it was within that space that Yu Manglong's image gradually shifted from an artist to a symbol of unnamed trauma. Looking back at this entire period, it is evident that what happened was not the result of a single wrong decision. It was the product of a long process where pressure accumulated, choices narrowed, and the individual voice gradually lost its weight. When warning signs appeared, they were not seen as signals requiring intervention, but were dissolved into the familiar operational rhythm of the industry. It is from here that the story begins to transcend the individual. For if such signs can be ignored for a long time, then the question is not just for Yu Manglong, but for an entire system that has made silence seem so normal. When individual signs began to be pieced together by the public into a larger picture, the story moved into another phase. It no longer existed within the scope of personal performances or live streams, but poured into the media space with the speed of an avalanche. Every old detail was unearthed, every ambiguous statement was edited together, and every information gap became a pivot for new speculation. This process did not happen according to a unified plan, but it shared a common characteristic. It was driven by the feeling that the prolonged silence had exceeded the public's threshold of acceptance. At this stage, social media acted as an echo chamber. Symbolic images, online signatures, and posters calling for the truth appeared in increasing numbers, crossing linguistic and geographical borders. For a segment of followers, this action was not just support for an individual, but a way to take a stand against a mechanism they believed had failed to protect human beings. However, parallel to this was another, more cautious stream of opinion, arguing that many speculations were going too far beyond the verified data currently available. This polarization created a field of intense debate. One side emphasized the series of abnormal signs, viewing them as indirect evidence of prolonged control and trauma. The other side questioned the boundary between empathy and conjecture, fearing that collective emotion could lead to unverifiable conclusions. Notably, both streams of opinion existed side by side, not canceling each other out, but together contributing to keeping the story in constant discussion. In that context, the role of mainstream media became particularly sensitive. Instead of deep investigative reports, the public mostly witnessed silence or minimal reporting, focusing on brief statements and avoiding digging into details. This caution could be explained by many factors, from legal risks to limits on information access. However, in the eyes of many followers, that silence was interpreted as a form of systematic avoidance, causing the gap between public expectation and media response to widen further. Simultaneously, statements from the management company appeared with strict legal language, emphasizing the termination of contractual relations and denying responsibility related to personal developments. Formally, this is a familiar approach in crisis communication: minimize information, avoid commenting outside the legal scope, and put an end to the official connection. But emotionally, this approach created the opposite effect. When a story heavily laden with human elements is answered with cold communiques, the sense of distance and lack of understanding becomes even more pronounced. What kept public opinion vibrant was not just the content of the statements, but what was left unsaid. There were no detailed explanations for the controversial timelines. There was no direct response to the abnormal signs recorded by the public. That void became a favorable environment for circulating hypotheses. In modern media, a lack of information rarely creates reassurance. On the contrary, it is often filled with stories constructed by the community itself. Another factor increasing the intensity of the avalanche was the fact that indirectly related characters were also pulled into the vortex of public opinion. Strange statements in live streams, strong emotional reactions to seemingly harmless questions, all were placed under a lens of suspicion. Although there was no direct evidence of a causal link, the coincidence of timing and expression was enough to trigger the collective imagination. This is the dark side of open media space, where every detail can be interpreted in multiple ways. During this process, the line between searching for the truth and consuming tragedy became fragile. One part of the public approached the story with the desire to clarify what had been hidden. Another part was swept up in the rhythm of information, sharing and commenting without clearly distinguishing between facts and speculation. This difference did not weaken the wave of discussion. On the contrary, it made it spread further, as each group found its own reasons to continue following. It is noteworthy that throughout this entire explosion phase, the central character of the story still had no opportunity to speak for himself directly. That absence, whether for objective or subjective reasons, contributed to transforming him from an individual into a symbol. When a person cannot tell their own story, that story will be told by others in ways that reflect their own fears, expectations, and biases. And once one has become a symbol, every related detail carries a meaning far beyond itself. From a media perspective, this is the time when silence carries a special weight. Not the silence of an individual, but the silence of the institutions expected to provide information, orientation, and accountability. It was this silence that pushed the public into the role of reluctant investigators, forcing them to piece together data themselves under conditions of insufficient official information. From there, the story was no longer just about one artist and what happened to him. It became a test of how society reacts to information gaps, how media balances caution and transparency, and how organizations face human-centric crises. A media avalanche, once formed, rarely stops with just brief statements. It only settles when there is enough light to melt the ice of suspicion. As the story reached this stage, the boundary between a personal tragedy and a structural issue gradually blurred. What happened to Yu Manglong was no longer seen as a series of isolated events, but as the convergent result of multiple layers of overlapping, prolonged, and difficult-to-resolve pressures. This was the time when financial details, contracts, and personal control began to be placed under more serious analytical light. According to information circulating within the follower community, one of the greatest burdens Yu Manglong faced was financial issues arising from contracts signed during a period when he did not directly participate in the decision-making. The figures mentioned were overwhelming not just because of their scale, but because of how responsibility was allocated. When financial obligations were heaped upon the individual artist, while the right to negotiate and choose projects was restricted, the imbalance became stark. This was no longer a story about professional success or failure, but about control over one's own future. At what was considered the darkest time, these factors converged. On one hand was the pressure from breach of contract clauses, with compensation levels far exceeding actual ability to pay. On the other hand was the decline in work opportunities, making the ability to resolve the financial burden oneself almost non-existent. In those circumstances, the concept of an escape became vague. When every choice led to loss, silence and endurance were easily seen as the least risky options, even if the price to be paid was mental health and the sense of being deprived of autonomy. After Yu Manglong no longer appeared, another controversial detail continued to raise questions about ethical boundaries in the industry. This was the fact that his image and related products were still being used in a context where the legal status and contractual relations had not been fully clarified. For many, this was the moment the story touched a threshold that could not be ignored. For when an individual is no longer able to protect their own image, the exploitation of that image becomes an issue that is not just legal but deeply ethical. From this point, the public's perspective began to expand into spaces outside the pure entertainment industry. Shares from those within artistic circles, especially training academies, painted a worrying picture of power mechanisms operating from very early on. In that environment, those in power do not just decide grades or professional opportunities, they directly influence the student's future. When power is concentrated and lacks oversight mechanisms, abuse becomes a constant risk, and silence is maintained as a condition for survival. Descriptions of the spiral of silence show a familiar model. Those newly entering the system are taught that to move forward, one must accept hidden rules. Parents, out of fear of damaging their children's futures, choose not to speak up. Colleagues, having been part of the system themselves or not wanting to become the next target, also remain silent. Over time, that silence becomes the norm, and those who resist are seen as intolerable exceptions. Placing Yu Manglong in this context, many began to see a disturbing similarity. An individual enters the system early, is guided by those with power, is bound by contracts and expectations, and gradually loses the space to say no. While there is no evidence confirming every detail is the same, the structural similarity of power is hard to deny. And it is this similarity that has caused Yu Manglong's story to be seen as a surface manifestation of a much deeper problem. The climax of enlightenment did not come from a single revelation, but from the accumulation of public awareness. When the pieces were placed together, from mental signs, financial pressure, and asymmetrical contracts to the lack of transparency in training and management, a large question gradually formed. If this system can operate in a way that allows an individual to fall into such a state without timely intervention mechanisms, then how many other cases have been and are being hidden? When the velvet curtain closes, what truly remains is not the applause, but the chill of a void that cannot yet be filled. Yu Manglong now exists as a massive question mark hanging in the artistic sky, where glory sometimes becomes a shadow that swallows a person's autonomy. Are we witnessing the end of a fate, or are we seeing the cracking of an entire system operated by silence and harsh hidden rules? The shift from an entertainment scandal to a dialogue about dignity and self-determination has completely changed the nature of the issue. The most painful question now is no longer what happened, but what environment allowed that isolation to last so long? Between dense contracts and a silence deemed wise, the individual artist becomes more fragile than ever. Can we, the observers, find the right boundary between sincere empathy and the unintentional consumption of a human being's pain? Social awareness may be slow, but once it changes, it will never go back to the way it was. Yu Manglong will perhaps forever be a landmark, reminding us of the responsibility behind every stage light. When the spotlight goes out, what will remain to protect the human being behind the title of artist? That question remains, waiting for the courage of each of us to find the answer, before another tragedy is named under the silence of time. Your every concern at this moment is a brick building the wall that protects the truth. Please accompany me by clicking like or subscribe, and do not hesitate to share your feelings in the comments section. Your voice is the power to ensure that stories like Yu Manglong's never sink into nothingness.